It is 10 o'clock, so I will go ahead and get us started. Good morning. I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's Office Manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Invisible Disabilities and Bias, Physical Disabilities, and today's presenter, Heather Hobbs-Woodard. Heather Hobbs-Woodard is a college English professor who has presented disability etiquette, sensitivity training previously for Swiftland patrons as webinars and in person. She is also an author, freelance writer, and business owner who has cerebral palsy, and she is partially blind. Currently, she teaches virtual English classes at 2 colleges in the Birmingham, Alabama area, and she takes every opportunity that she can to show others that living a fulfilling life with a disability is not only a possible goal, but an attainable one. Ms. Woodard graduated from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa with a Master of Arts in English and dual specialization in rhetoric and composition and American literature. Please welcome Heather and enjoy her webinar this morning. Heather?
Good morning, everyone. Taylor, thank you so much for that introduction. I am so delighted to be back working with Swiftland and talking with you all about the hidden and not so hidden challenges of invisible disabilities. And I think it's especially fitting that I'm here with you on the 29th anniversary of a piece of legislation called the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have made so much progress in the near 3 decades since that's passed, but there's more work to do, and so I am glad to be here and want to help you learn about everything that tends to manifest itself with invisible disabilities, because it's sort of a whole new and tough world to navigate if you have an invisible disability. And my invisible disability, more or less, is my partial blindness. Good morning, Luli and Ronald. Glad to have you all along. So as we go through this presentation, please feel free to ask questions, share commentary, bounce ideas off of us. Anything that you have to contribute that would help us is more than welcome. So we're going to begin by giving a little bit of an overview about what our overall goals are, not only as a society, but particularly as people with disabilities, because everyone deserves access, inclusion, acceptance, respect, involvement, diversity, and education. And I would also add equal opportunity. That wasn't in this particular set here, but opportunity is everything, especially when you are disabled. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go along. Okay, so a few general truths about invisible physical disabilities in particular that I think are important to emphasize here. First is the idea that bias in society from way back, and I'm talking hundreds, if not thousands of years, there's been an epidemic of bias among those and toward those who have invisible physical as well as mental disabilities. And in my follow-up webinar scheduled for August, we're going to talk a lot more about invisible mental disabilities and the different challenges that those present, even in addition to and aside from those invisible physical disabilities. Inherent in that bias is the idea that people tend to judge that which they cannot see much more harshly than that which they are able to visualize. And the reason that this is important is because if you can see something, you're more likely to believe that it exists. And the prevailing thought toward those with physical disabilities when they encounter skepticism, it's generally the idea of, oh, you don't look sick, or you don't look like you have a problem. What's the deal? So it's important to learn so that you can avoid jumping to wrong conclusions, for sure. And honesty regarding the presence of a physical or mental disability, especially if it's invisible, is a hard choice for some of us. I almost never disclose my visual impairment. In this case, it obviously is appropriate because of what we're talking about, but in most cases, I don't divulge that I have a vision impairment. But as a general rule, we as a people do tend to be slightly more understanding of physical disabilities because people get that there's a connection between the physical impairment and either your ability to, either your decline in functioning or your ability or inability to function. For example, one manifestation of my partial blindness is that I'm not able to drive. I'm lucky that I have a husband and friends and other people who are willing to take me where I need to go when I need to go, but it's still very frustrating. Okay, we're going to talk about stigma because stigma, stereotyping, bias, all of those things are sort of interrelated and overlapping. And so some of the points regarding invisible disabilities and stigma are the severity of the problem, because people's mental and physical disabilities that are invisible often are not taken seriously. And we are accused of trying to take advantage of others if we reveal the presence of a disability. And of course, as a result of not being able to see it, people don't always take that seriously. And the challenge for those who are trying to navigate this is that you can't determine whether an invisible disability is present unless somebody tells you or it manifests itself directly. And those of us who have invisible disabilities could face more societal abuse and ridicule than those who have visible disabilities. And I've talked about that to a certain extent, but it has to do with people's levels of skepticism. Sometimes they just don't believe that a disability is actually present, even when someone reveals that they have a disability. And it does definitely result in higher levels of stress if we have to fight for access or fight for accommodation based on an invisible disability that isn't apparent to other people. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, great. We're going to move on here. So again, just to clarify, the question comes up as to whether some of these conditions are really actual disabilities, and the answer is yes. And you'll see this by the definition of a general disability and then what the disability entails. So a disability, according to the World Health Organization, is defined formally as any restriction or lack of ability to perform an activity in a manner within a range considered normal for a human being. Now, I've got kind of a lot to say about this, so I'm going to condense it down as much as I can. But the question that you would want to ask yourself if you're looking at a definition like this is, who gets to determine what's normal? And it's based on societal mores. It's based on what those who set these types of baselines, if you will, believe, honestly. So, what's normal for me might not be normal for you or for anyone else for that matter. But there is sort of this baseline level. It's expected, for example, that the vast majority of people can walk. It's expected, for example, that the vast majority of people have reliable transportation. It's expected that the vast majority of people can see, hear, and talk. And that may actually be true, but for those of us who have difficulties with these daily functions, that's what renders us disabled, if you will. So the term disability, and this is very important, reflects the consequences of impairment in terms of functional performance and activity by the person. Okay, by the person, by the individual. Therefore, disabilities reflect disturbances at the individual level. And again, we're going to talk about this not only in this seminar, but also in my follow-up webinar on mental and cognitive disabilities in August. So because the way that disability reflects the consequences of impairment is different on the mental cognitive side than it is on the physical side. So this is just a little graphic reminder. Not every disability is a visible one. So you as librarians and people who serve the public, that is what I would encourage you to carry forward and remember, that you will encounter disabled patrons and they won't always tell you that they're disabled, and you won't be able to tell by just looking at them whether they're disabled. So definitely carry forward and remember as much as possible that not every disability is a visible one, and you won't always know. But there are things that you can do to help, and there are things that you can look for that may help you discern whether someone may need extra help. Okay, so generally speaking, this is what we're here to talk about. What is an invisible disability? So it refers to symptoms such as debilitating pain, fatigue, dizziness, cognitive dysfunctions, brain injuries, learning differences, and mental health disorders, as well as vision and hearing impairments. So we're seeing here, even by just looking at this definition, that is such a wide range of symptoms and parts that are affected, if you will. And as I've already stated, these aren't always obvious to the onlooker, but they can sometimes or always. And I would say a disability almost always limits daily activities. And there are ways that you can adjust, and there are coping mechanisms that you can employ to overcome those limitations put forth by your disability. But even those can be limited and vary from person to person. So the condition of disability is always, will always be, and has always been individual. Okay, so another major concept that we are discussing within this particular seminar that will also be followed up in our August seminar is the idea of bias. So the reason that this is so important in this discussion is that disabled people, whether they have visible disabilities, invisible disabilities of any nature, mental, social, cognitive, physical, whatever, if it is known that we are disabled, we are often looked at negatively, and we face a lot of discrimination. And so bias toward people with disabilities stems largely from ableism. And ableism, in a general sense, is just the idea that everyone should be able to function at a certain baseline or a certain level, no matter what. And so ableism typically will not take into account different individual factors that people have to work through or overcome. Bias can be conscious or unconscious. Conscious bias involves a deliberate decision to view someone or something negatively, and unconscious bias stems typically from misinformation, ignorance, or fear. And I, as a disabled person and a teacher and someone who is active in her community, at least as active as I can be, I am a lot more understanding of unconscious bias than I am of conscious bias, because conscious bias to me is just mean, and it's completely unfair. Unconscious bias is, to me, understandable. People tend to fear or mistrust or be unsure about that which they don't understand. And disability is not, as a general rule, widely understood. And so that's what's part of what is so significant about the ADA, is that that piece of legislation, comprehensive as it is and imperfect as it is, one thing that it has done is it has increased overall the understanding that disabled people deserve a place in society, and we deserve to be able to function and integrate and participate in society. And so I would encourage you to think about, thank you, Kimberly. I would encourage you to think about this whenever you see any patron, because again, you don't know whether that person is disabled or not, but especially if someone seems to be struggling, please, think about what they may be facing. And it's hard for some people with disabilities, especially, to ask for help. It's very hard for me to ask for help sometimes. So it may be helpful to consider the idea that you won't always know if someone needs help, so you may have to ask directly or find another way to communicate your willingness to assist. We're going to talk about that too. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all. We're going to move forward. So here's perhaps one of the most important questions that we're going to cover, period. How can bias affect those who have invisible disabilities directly? Okay, and that last word is very important, because bias can definitely affect us indirectly as well, but it's more important to know how bias can affect those of us who have invisible disabilities directly. So on one point or one side, people may discount legitimate physical pain, mental effects, or emotional challenges. Because I'm here to tell you, those of us who have disabilities love, when we can, to be able to minimize the effects of those disabilities. We try not to make a big deal out of it, but sometimes your disability, as it were, just doesn't cooperate, and you have to be able to disclose and explain what's going on so that you can get assistance. But there's a lot of levels of challenges with regard to that, because we do struggle with discounting certain aspects or deciding whether to reveal certain aspects. So people with invisible disabilities are more likely to have work hours cut or lose their jobs entirely if they reveal the presence of a disability. I have two very good friends that I can think of right off the top of my head who are dealing with invisible disabilities, but they have not revealed and will not reveal the presence of a disability in their jobs because they're afraid of the consequences of doing so. And I'll be honest, I wish I had the luxury of deciding whether I could reveal the presence of a disability. And in a way I do, because I don't have to tell anybody that I have cerebral palsy, but in my case, it is visible. If you look at me sitting or standing, it's visible. So people know right away, hey, there's something different about her. And so it really is a difficult choice. People with invisible disabilities often experience a decline in their social lives because often when a disability is revealed, people don't know how to react to that. And also, people with invisible disabilities will often experience pain or fatigue, as was mentioned previously, and so they don't have a lot of energy for a social life, perhaps. And then definitely, people with invisible disabilities often experience a markedly higher level of skepticism, impatience, or genuine contempt from strangers. And I could fill this entire webinar with stories that have affected me in this manner. I won't do that to y'all, but it definitely happens. Oh, wow, Kimberly. So what did you guys do to help your coworker? And that's the thing. I mean, her coworker was afraid to reveal the presence of diabetes, and it caused a problem. And so we should be able to reveal the presence of a disability if we want to do so without worrying about the consequences of doing so. But unfortunately, bias is a huge reason why we can't, or why we often cannot. Oh, great. I'm so glad she was taken care of. It's definitely a steep learning curve the first time that something like that happens. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about consequences here, but I'm going to go into more detail. Once someone reveals the presence of an invisible disability, one can often face heavy bias from professionals in the medical or legal fields. Now, the former has happened to me. I have absolutely faced personal bias from medical professionals, which seems astounding to me because you would think that medical professionals would be more equipped uh, to take care of disabled people, but sometimes they're just not. People with invisible disabilities may experience bias during certain legal proceedings and with law enforcement interaction. We see episodes in the media all the time, or at least I do, and maybe it's because part of me is looking for it, um, where people with autism especially will have challenging encounters with law enforcement. And so now there are, as Ronald suggests here, yes, wearing a bracelet noting the disability could be a huge difference maker. But again, the person who's disabled has to decide to wear it and has to decide that this can be revealed. And sometimes that's a hard choice. Some people get blamed for the presence of a disability over which they have no direct control. This happens often before a disability is diagnosed or acknowledged. I can't tell you how many friends I have had that have gone through this. I myself am very fortunate for the most part. I have never been blamed for my disability among my family members or people who know me, but now strangers will come up and say crazy things or have come up and said crazy things. I had a lady in Walmart one time. I was in a wheelchair and she very pointedly and very rudely asked me what I did to myself. And I looked straight at her and I told her nothing. And then I left. But those types of encounters make me mad because that's a huge misassumption. So, Kimberly, it sounds like you've witnessed also an encounter with law enforcement and a person who is disabled. And it happens quite often, comparatively speaking. And people with autism in particular may have a hard time communicating. So that makes it even harder for them to address the situation. Students with all types of disabilities are often disciplined more frequently and harshly than their typical peers, and they are often excluded from participation in various activities. Again, and I focus on students here because I'm a teacher, but I have faced this as a student and faced this as a teacher. It's not so much that I was disciplined more frequently or harshly than my typical peers, but I definitely have been excluded from participation in various activities because of my disability, and I have had to advocate for myself to avoid being excluded. At my high school graduation, they wanted to bring the diploma down to me instead of having me walk to the stage, and I said, no, sir, I'm going to walk. And when I was in college, I actually became a member of Sigma Tau Delta, which is the International English Honor Society. And we got an invitation to go to England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to go to Europe my senior year. And my parents were like, oh, this is great. We were having a hard time deciding on a graduation gift for you. Let's just let that be it. I was like, great. Well, my advisor did some calling around and he found out that I would not be able to go on this major trip because I wouldn't be able to physically keep up with the rest of the participants. And at that time, Europe had not made a great number of strides in addressing equal access with people with disabilities. So I missed out on that. And I was thankfully not mad at my instructor, but I was just very upset that I missed that opportunity. So it definitely happens. Oh, Melanie, yes. If you know someone with a disability or you have a disability, I think it's definitely true that you generally are much more compassionate, or at least more compassionate than those of us who don't have direct experience. Okay, so how are people with invisible disabilities viewed negatively by society? And this is a little bit different than how bias affects people with invisible disabilities. And so this one again affects me at times. People with visible or invisible physical impairments are assumed often to have cognitive disabilities when no mental disability is present. So present, not pregnant, present. So there does seem to be an emphasis on a connection when there really isn't necessarily a connection between one's physical ability and mental ability. People who have invisible disabilities are often accused of faking or imagining them. This is also true with people who have visible disabilities. People with invisible disabilities like mental disabilities or learning challenges are presumed to be stupid or incapable of making decisions. In the media, we are not always represented or celebrated for legitimate achievements because too often the focus on the fact that the disability is present overwhelms the rest of it. And this one really struck me. Job applicants are 26% less likely to receive an offer if the presence of a disability is known or revealed. And that includes invisible disabilities. So you think about that. 1 in 4 of us, more than 1 in 4 of us, are less likely to receive an offer just because we are disabled. And of course, this is why people don't like to reveal. It makes perfect sense. So, and I don't really feel pressure to disclose at this point because my students don't see me. You know, I teach online, so I'm behind the computer screen, they're behind the computer screen. We don't see each other. But if I'm teaching if I'm teaching an on-campus class, my disability is visible, so I will disclose. Invisible disabilities and stigmas. Some of this we've already spoken about, but others I want to emphasize here as well. And that would be the second one. People with invisible physical disabilities don't deserve access to spaces reserved for those with special needs. These spaces include parking spots and restroom stalls. And I have a visible disability, and I've had to fight for an accessible restroom stall before. It's a drag. People with invisible disabilities shouldn't be allowed to utilize service animals in public places. Not true. People with invisible disabilities just want sympathy and an easy way out of obligations. Not true. If that were true, don't you think we would be revealing a lot more often than we are? That's sort of what I would think. Any questions or comments? Please let me know. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about a concept here that is widely discussed in disability circles, not so widely discussed in other circles. But the question is often to pass or not to pass. And honestly, I prefer to pass when I can. If you are sitting here listening to me talk, you cannot tell through my speech that I have cerebral palsy or that I am partially blind. Of course, I reveal those. But to pass or not to pass is a serious question because it depends on how comfortable we are with where we're going and who we're going to see. Do we want them to know that we're disabled? In a job interview situation, I never disclose unless I'm sitting in front of a person. And even then, they're not allowed to ask me whether I'm disabled, but I will go ahead and reveal it because it's obvious. It's like the pink elephant in the room. Get it out of the way so that you can move forward with the rest of the interview, so to speak. And I would say also that disabilities aren't revealed as often like on dating sites. Now there are dating sites with people for people with disabilities, but if someone with a disability is on a dating site, they're less likely to reveal the presence of their disability. So that's two widely used applications where people have to decide whether they want to disclose or not. Okay, disclosure. This concept is, to me, as equally important as bias, because disclosure is extremely tricky. In deciding to disclose, you have to weigh the risk of disclosure versus what could happen if one chooses not to reveal the disability. And for me, from what I've researched and in talking to people, the issue of disclosure is even more tricky if you have a mental, cognitive, or social disability than it is if you have an invisible physical disability. So we're going to talk about that in the August seminar that will be part 2 of this particular series. But disclosure is not a legal requirement if a person does not seek legal accommodation. So if I don't ask for legal accommodations, I don't have to disclose. So again, in teaching my virtual students, I never disclose. I never disclosed to my administrators at one of my schools that I was disabled because I only teach online for them. They've never seen me in person. I don't disclose. But if a person chooses to seek legal accommodation, some form of disclosure is required in the form of medical documentation. So if you want an accommodation, you must disclose whether your disability is invisible or not. So, but even if I were to disclose the nature of my CP or my blindness or the presence of it, that nobody has to know to what extent I have CP or am partially blind. Okay, so how does disclosure pertain to library patrons? You guys and ladies, as librarians, will and do encounter an incredibly wide variety of people who use your facility for a wide variety of reasons. So that in and of itself can affect disclosure. Different patrons will need various levels of assistance. And then if the patrons choose to acknowledge the presence of a disability, you're lucky because then you can figure out how you can help them even more. But of course, one of the great things about libraries is that they will have the tools and technology available to help patrons who have special needs. And it may be to your benefit to determine whether your library could possibly use additional technological equipment to help people with visible and invisible disabilities. And many people with disabilities, myself included, especially when I was in college or in grad school, I went to the library because that was my happy place. It helped me escape. And so I'm sure that you have patrons who view the library as that safe place, that non-judgmental place. I can just go in there and sit down and breathe, or I can read, or I can peruse the internet, or I can look for a job, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to talk about some common invisible physical disabilities. And the main thing that we're going to focus on here are some of the characteristics that will help you determine to what extent these types of disabilities will affect your patrons. And in doing so, that should hopefully assist you in helping them more thoroughly. So you can see this list here, and we're just going to take them one by one. And I didn't put these in any given specific order. They just kind of, when I was doing the research to put this together, these were the conditions that stood out. And I'm going to be honest, I know people with every one of these conditions. Every one of these conditions, every one of these categories of conditions. And I would bet that you may also know people with all of these conditions because maybe they haven't revealed that condition to you, so you may know them and not even know that they have a disability. Okay, so the first of our conditions is fibromyalgia or fibro. It's an autonomic nervous system disability, and it affects approximately 4 million Americans, and 76% of whom are women. That's over 3/4 of people affected with fibro are thought to be women here in America. And I will say too, one of the really interesting aspects that I found out in researching all of these conditions is that for the most part, they all seem to affect women and females more so than men and boys. I don't know why that is. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But you can look at some of the general physical characteristics of fibro: chronic pain, gastrointestinal distress, dizziness, severe chest pains, tingling in hands and feet, etc., etc. And the symptoms that are probably going to likely manifest themselves if a patron who has fibro is in your library would probably be the pain, the dizziness, and the chest pains. I actually have had students with fibro who have experienced it, and they have literally had to leave the room. And I let them go. But there's a whole lot to learn about this condition. But fibro is often mistaken also for other disabilities like MS or CP. I've had people ask if I have fibro, and I tell them no, I have cerebral palsy. I've had people ask me if I've had MS. No, I have cerebral palsy. So one of the things also that I noticed in researching all of these is that some of these symptoms for the various conditions really do seem to overlap. But think about that, 4 million Americans with fibro. That's about one in a thousand at this point. Okay, EHLERS-DANLOS syndrome. This is a genetic connective tissue disease, and people who are generally diagnosed with EDS are diagnosed a little bit later in life. I have a friend who's also a teacher who has this, and she is in her, I believe, early 40s, and I don't think she knew about her EDS until she was an adult. But EDS is characterized by overly flexible joints, and when those joints are stretched, EDS patients experience a lot of pain. They're prone to bruising. They may have visible blood vessels, and they may have distinctive facial features. I would say my friend has the prominent eyes and the thin nose. And again, that's part of just a general list of factors. And Ehlers-Danlos is typically hereditary. So a lot of people with Ehlers-Danlos will not bear children of their own. They will make the decision because the risk of passing on the condition is pretty high. But they can be helped with physical therapy, diet, and blood pressure monitoring. And my friend does all of this, and she also uses braces. So she does take the precautions necessary to protect herself, but sometimes it just tires her out. Okay, chronic fatigue syndrome. It is extremely understood. And part of the reason that it's extremely understood is because there are a wide variety of syndromes and symptoms, not syndromes, symptoms in the overall umbrella that is CFS. So essentially, this condition is highlighted by severe widespread muscle and joint pain, cognitive difficulties, primarily, I think, forgetfulness. I have 3 friends with CFS, and they all say that the most frustrating non-physical aspect of CFS is forgetfulness. And then chronic physical and mental exhaustion. I know a friend of mine who literally makes it a priority to get like 12 hours of sleep a night. She goes to bed at 8 and doesn't get up until 8 the next morning, and she's still exhausted. So about 1 million Americans are affected, and 8 in 10 of those cases are undiagnosed. So my guess would be that there's a fair number of people who have CFS and don't recognize it. And I would say that's true for all of these conditions, maybe not all of them, but for a good number of the various individual conditions that we're discussing, there are going to be a fair number of people who don't know that they're disabled. Just like a lot of people don't know that they have diabetes, for example. Any questions or comments? Please feel free to chime in. Okay. Official physical symptoms of CFS or chronic fatigue syndrome. You can see the list here. The common risk factors are age. CFS typically strikes people in their 40s or 50s. I've actually known people who have gotten it much earlier in life, but from what I've researched, the typical age range where CFS really manifests itself is in the 40s and 50s, so middle age. Women are affected far more frequently, and then you can also have CFS exacerbated by personal and environmental stress levels. So if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, doctors will tell you lower your stress levels. And we all know that sometimes that is just not possible, unfortunately. Okay, epilepsy. It's a neurological condition that is characterized frequently by various types of seizures. It's primarily considered a disability if seizures are uncontrollable. Now let's talk about this for just a second. I want to go back and emphasize that. It's primarily considered a disability if seizures are uncontrollable. And the reason for that is that the presence and severity of seizures can affect how you function if you have epilepsy. I have a teenage friend at church who has epilepsy, and because of it, he has massive headaches, he has periodic seizures, he cannot drive, and his parents pretty much follow him wherever he goes because they are, frankly, worried. And so, you know, that is something that we may not even think about, is just the types of limits that it puts on you through no fault of your own. It's not Zane's fault that he can't drive. It's not Zane's fault that his mom is worried about him, but it is what it is. So therefore, people who have epilepsy could very well be susceptible to emotional problems that could be triggered by the condition or medication side effects. And the medication side effects for several of these conditions can be very far-reaching and very significant. And as with many disabilities, there is no single root cause of epilepsy. Okay, possible risk factors and triggers: premature birth, seizure occurrence, head trauma, stroke, family history, hot water on the head, and flashing lights. Those last two triggers, if you will, and I would say probably most of these are triggers. Well, about half are triggers and half are risk factors here. But the hot water on the head and the flashing lights are particularly significant here because even places like movie theaters or restaurants will sometimes state that their environment is not safe for people with epilepsy because of the lights, especially. I know there are some movies that people with epilepsy cannot and should not see because it's just not safe for them to do so. Lupus is also an autoimmune disease that can affect different parts of the body. And the problem with lupus is that your immune system turns on you, basically, because the immune system cannot differentiate between the antigens and the tissues and cells in the body. So it creates substances that fight against the immune system. And so approximately 1.5 to 2 million Americans live with lupus. And I know I have a friend who lives here in Alabama with me. She's at the other end of my state, but she had just posted on Facebook the other day about how frustrating and tired of lupus she was. So sometimes you really do get tired and discouraged when you have to live with some of these conditions. So primary physical symptoms of lupus: achy joints, high fevers, extreme long-term fatigue. I would possibly even amend that long-term to near constant or constant. Anemia. My friend with lupus cooks from cast iron. That's something that her doctor told her to do to try to address that. So there are things you can do. Light sensitivity and various rashes. I've seen rashes that are affiliated with lupus, and they are no joke. They can be quite uncomfortable. And the thing about these various symptoms that pertain to many of these conditions is you never know when a symptom or a problem is going to just come out of the blue and manifest itself. And so that's something that you have to be aware of. Any questions or comments? Okay, causes or triggers: genetics, extreme stress, dramatic changes or shifts in the weather. This is the trigger that I hear about from my friend most often. She is consistently saying that major shifts in the weather, or even humidity, or if rain comes, her lupus flares up. And she has to be really careful about the types of medicines that she takes. She goes through her doctor for everything with regard to that, as you should, but I mean, she has to be even more careful. Okay. Multiple sclerosis. Again, this is probably far more common than you would think. And I have a mother-in-law and 2 close friends with MS, and this disease is a booger. I use the term loosely, but it is especially challenging. And so it's an inflammatory disease in which the insulating covers of nerve cells called the myelin in the brain and spinal cord are damaged. And what happens is that lesions will appear. Sometimes lesions won't even appear, but they'll manifest themselves within the cells. And so that's what causes, or that's what, yeah, I would say that's what causes, or that's what allows MS to manifest itself, are these lesions. 1 million people in the United States live with MS. Note that this is nearly twice the initial estimate. So that's why I was saying that MS is probably far more common than you would think. And I would also point out, just based on my research, that there are probably many more people who have MS that are not diagnosed because they think it's something else, or they might be afraid to go to the doctor, et cetera, et cetera. Myelin damage disrupts communication between your brain and the rest of your body, and the nerves themselves in the later stages of MS may deteriorate. The process right now is irreversible, but you may have read in the headlines recently that it's believed that they're very, very close to a cure. So I am personally praying that one is found and able to be implemented to ditch this awful disease, this awful disability. Okay, general characteristics of MS. And as I said earlier, MS and CP sometimes are mixed up because we have a lot of the similar conditions, especially with balance, coordination, and walking, numbness and tingling, blurry or abnormal vision, constant fatigue, high risk of seizures, among other conditions here or other symptoms. Causes and risk factors. Again, the cause is the destruction of protected myelin sheath, and the lesions are what cause that. But also heredity, gender, and Caucasian ethnic origin can contribute to that. Visual impairments, blindness, partial blindness. Approximately 7.4 million people in the United States are visually impaired, and we do have categories of vision impairment, such as partially sighted, low vision, legally blind, and totally blind. I'm legally blind. I'm not totally blind, but these visual impairments are not fixable by usual means such as glasses or medication. Even though I wear glasses, I'm still visually impaired. Okay, different causes, risk factors, or emphases within visual impairments: glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, age-related macular degeneration. I would say, based on my research, that will be the most common cause of visual impairment, particularly among older people, because as you age, the cells within the retina that allow people to see detail have died. The cells just kind of go kaput, so to speak. And then some people are born blind and others become blind as a result of accidents or other conditions. Okay, hearing impairments. 11 million people in the United States identify as deaf or hard of hearing as of 2019. And there are different types of hearing loss that occur because of different factors like inner ear or auditory nerve damage. That's your permanent hearing loss. And then you can have conductive hearing loss if you have earwax buildup or a punctured eardrum. And then you can get treatment for that. And then hearing loss can definitely occur gradually or suddenly. And if it occurs suddenly, get to a doctor. And then some people who experience sudden hearing loss will regain partial or complete hearing within a relatively short period of time. So that's good. There are circumstances that can mitigate these conditions to a certain extent. So possible risk factors: hearing impairment, certain diseases, meningitis is a big one, head trauma is a reason, aging is a reason, high blood pressure and inner ear damage. Okay, heart, respiratory, and circulatory diseases or disorders. And as we move forward here, I want to point out that those people who deal with these types of conditions probably face the most serious skepticism. I know a couple of people who have heart and circulatory diseases, and they always seem to catch grief from people. I have a friend who can't leave the house without wearing multiple layers of clothing, even in the summer, and people always laugh at her or point at her, or they will come up to her and ask her, why do you have a sweater on? But, you know, heart disease is extremely common, and it is caused or exacerbated by a decreased blood flow, and obviously a heart attack can be extremely sudden. Many people with heart or respiratory conditions have problems with their upper respiratory tract, and then cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the United States. I know I have a friend who was finally able to get a disabled parking placard because she was able to prove that she had a significant breathing condition. So again, it's frustrating, just the level of skepticism. And these respiratory conditions and heart conditions are serious. Some quick facts and stats with heart disease. It shows us how common it is. 1 in 4 deaths. So that's the leading cause of death in American men and women. That's kind of scary. And then we list the statistical cost as well as the high risk factors and then secondary risk factors. And some of this, of course, is going to be common sense. Common respiratory diseases: COPD, that typically is caused by smoking. Asthma is quite common in people of all ages. My 5-year-old nephew has it, and it can be caused by sensitization to certain agents like coal or dust, or by poor indoor air quality. And it has to do with the restriction of airflow that typically will cause an asthma attack, even if airflow between asthma attacks is usually good. And then cystic fibrosis. has to do with the buildup of mucus on your various organs, but you can control CF through breathing therapy and a balanced diet. And I should also mention that breathing therapy is often used for these other conditions that are listed as well. My nephew undertakes breathing treatments, I would say, semi-regularly. Common circulatory disorders, arteriosclerosis, stroke. We're all aware of stroke and hypertension, which is basically high blood pressure, and then PAD or peripheral artery disease. And common risk factors, again, these are pretty common sense. Smoking, diabetes, high cholesterol, poor diet, and physical inactivity. Now, this is also important, and this is why we're here. How can librarians assist patrons who have invisible disabilities, physical disabilities? One thing that you can do is keep or acquire information on various invisible disabilities and stay current in this knowledge. Again, we're going to be having a follow-up seminar in August on cognitive, mental, and social disabilities that are invisible. So that would be a great opportunity for you to learn more about just the general gist and prevalence of invisible disabilities and how to address them most effectively. You can also consider purchasing or earmarking items specifically for patrons with disabilities. Be understanding if we remain in place for a long time. It's hard to move when you're disabled sometimes. And of course, you want to be watchful of how others treat patrons with disabilities. If someone is being deliberately disrespectful, please consider stepping in and helping your patron who has a disability. Provide plentiful, comfortable seating and adjust light and temperature in the facility as necessary. That obviously is going to be helpful for everybody, not just for people who are disabled. But then you can ask specifically how you can help a patron who might be struggling. Again, this is very important for you to be as specific as possible, because some people are just not going to reach out and admit that they need help. And it's very frustrating. But that is driven by fear, and it can also be driven by past experience. If they haven't had positive interaction with people who aren't disabled, it's hard to reach out. So once a patron reveals the presence of a disability, engage deliberately and positively. Give encouragement. And if you haven't had to do so already, or if you haven't had the opportunity to do so already, consider preparing a detailed plan to assist patrons with disabilities in evacuating your facility. I can't emphasize how important that is. One of my schools here in the Birmingham area just had a seminar on how to assist people with physical disabilities in evacuating a building. So it would be worth it, I think, for you to find out more about that if you're not already aware of how to do that. Yeah, Nancy, I understand totally what you're saying, because young kids don't have a filter, especially when it comes to approaching people with disabilities, because they want to know why that person is different. And it's unfortunate that parents often don't step in. I can't speak for anybody else, but I am always very positive when young kids approach me or when they point or stare, because what I'll do is I'll ask the parent deliberately, may I talk to them? And I could not tell you the last time I was refused. So that's how I handle it myself. Is just to approach the child directly and ask the adult, can I speak with your child or with the child? And often they're very relieved that I've taken the initiative. But that certainly is understandable. Okay. These next 3 pages are just a list of works that I cited in doing research. And so I include those here for your perusal. They're almost all of them are virtual. So, and then actually the next 4 pages, goodness. And then here's my contact information. I would love to follow up with any or all of you if you have questions, or if there's a way that I can help you clarify some things that we've talked about today. I would love to be able to do that with you. So please feel free to reach out to Swiftland staff members or to me personally. I hope that you will consider coming and joining us in the part 2 of this particular seminar on invisible cognitive, social, and psychological disabilities. Would love to have everyone come and learn more and participate. And Ronald, you are exactly right. It is a teachable moment for adults and children. So, does anyone have any other questions or comments? Miss Deb, thank you so much for working with me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Luli and Taylor and Leanne, for allowing me to work with you. And I hope all of you have an awesome rest of the day. I'm going to sign off if there are no other questions. Thank you all for your positive comments. I really appreciate it. And again, I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I'm going to sign off. Thank you again.
Thank you, Heather, for an informative webinar. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, we ask that you join us on August 29th for Heather's next webinar, Invisible Disabilities and Bias, Mental and Cognitive Disabilities. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Deb.
much. Thanks,
Heather.
Taylor.